After nearly 8 months of fighting and displacement, the conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region has taken a new turn. In the past few hours, the federal government has announced a unilateral and unconditional ceasefire with immediate effect, while Tigrayan rebels are claiming victory and say they're in full control of the regional capital, Mekelle. Ethiopia's federal troops and officials have reportedly abandoned the city. The interim administration in Tigray, appointed by the central government, says it wants farmers to work on their harvests as the region is facing a devastating famine.
As we all know, the time we are in right now is the rainy season. The locust swarm destroyed almost all of the produce in Tigray last year, and they couldn't collect the remaining produce because of the war. And after this comes to pass, if they can't cultivate the harvest this rainy season, the problem for the community is not an easy one. It will not be resolved easily, and the community will have problems for years to come.
Getachew Reda is a senior member of the TPLF. He says President Abiy Ahmed has no moral authority to call a ceasefire.
We did launch our strategic offensive, the first chapter of our strategic offensive about 8 days ago, and we have been destroying units after units of Abiy Ahmed's army, and we destroyed especially the strongest units of the Ethiopian, so-called Ethiopian National Defense Forces, and today it was becoming increasingly obvious that Abiy's forces were not in a position to put up any effective resistance against our advance. I can only consider that as a very sick joke as far as we're concerned. Abiy didn't have any moral ground to call for a ceasefire because Abiy's government has been requested by the international community, including the U.S. government-appointed Jeffrey Feltman, to consider a humanitarian ceasefire, and he's been telling the whole world that he had no stomach whatsoever for such moves.
More now from Malcolm Webb, who's monitoring those developments from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi.
The Tigrayan People's Liberation Front began an offensive about a week ago, and we heard that just a few hours ago there was heavy fighting on the outskirts of the city, around the airport, on the edge of the city of Mekelle and other places on the outskirts of the city. That went on for several hours, and then people we've spoken to there say that the TPLF forces took control. They came into the center of the city, took control of key road junctions around the outside of the city, and that the Ethiopian government forces left. Now, since then, there have been people cheering along with TPLF fighters in the streets of the city, shooting fireworks. Government administrators from that federal government-appointed administration that had been there since this conflict began in November, they've fled just in the last few hours or in the last couple of days. So certainly there's jubilation at the moment for people on the streets of the city, Mekelle, the regional capital. We don't know yet what this means and if there's going to be stability across the whole of the rest of the region. And a lot of this conflict has been fought quite brutally in the small towns and the villages, when there have been numerous reports of massacres over the last few months of civilians, particularly young men and boys who seem to be of fighting age, who've been reportedly killed by Eritrean and Ethiopian troops. But certainly Mekelle is the big prize here, and everything suggests that the TPLF have taken control of it once again.
Well, earlier UNICEF said its offices were attacked in Tigray's main city, Mekelle, and the spokesman for the UN Secretary General is calling for restraint.
A number of you asked me about reports of attacks or on humanitarian assets in Mekelle, and I can tell you that we condemn any and all attacks on humanitarian workers and assets, and remind again all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law. All parties must ensure the protection of civilians, and that all humanitarian assistance provided by the United Nations is provided according to humanitarian principles. The safety of our staff is a priority, and we are doing everything we can to ensure it.
So let's take a closer look at the conflict between the Ethiopian army and Tigrayan rebels, and it goes back decades. The TPLF party dominated Ethiopian politics for nearly 30 years, until Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took power in 2018. Abiy ordered a military operation against the group in Tigray in November after he said it attacked army bases. The TPLF says it was unfairly targeted. Tigray opposition parties say more than 50,000 people have been killed. The UN says more than 350,000 face risk of famine. Let's bring in William Lawrence. He's a former US diplomat and regional security officer in West Africa. He's also a professor of political science at the American University. He joins us via Skype from Washington, D.C. William, good to have you back with us. How surprised are you that this ceasefire has been declared? Because it came very quickly. And is it likely to hold, do you think?
I was a little bit surprised. To some degree, it's an Ethiopian ceasefire in defeat by the government, and it's sort of a Pyrrhic victory by the Tigrayan rebels, who took one city but really aren't in a position to take over their whole area. But it did come precipitously, and that means it's quite fragile. The Tigrayans are surrounded by pro-government militias to the west, Ethiopian government forces to the south, Eritrean forces to the north. So they're not going to get too far. But this does open up the very important space for humanitarian assistance, dealing with the famine, dealing with taking stock of this war that's gone on for 8 months. And so it's a positive step forward in that regard.
Yeah, and with federal forces being pushed out of Mekelle, does this show that the Ethiopian government was perhaps under pressure on the ground because of the military situation?
They were under pressure all over. There was not only the Tigrayan rebellion that was going on, but there were 2 other rebellions on that model going on in 2 other areas, Oromia and another. And there was sanctions by the U.S. government, incredible international pressure for the government to stand down. And then recently, the attack on the markets, which were quite devastating by Ethiopian planes, and of course the attacks on humanitarian aid workers, some of whom were killed and others whom had their equipment ransacked, as you reported. So all of that was creating a great amount of pressure on the government to just step back and abandon this offensive. And that's exactly what they've done. How long the ceasefire will last is anyone's guess, but they say they'll be out as long as the harvest season takes, and that means there's time to negotiate, which is what should have happened all along.
Yeah, William, just a final thought. I mean, as ever, it's innocent civilians who continue to pay a heavy price in this conflict. The UN's been warning for some time, as you know, that 5 million people need food aid and 350,000 are facing famine in northern Ethiopia.
Yeah, as you know, there are these phases, and 350,000 are in phase 5. That means they're in famine. They are starving. And there's another over 1 million that are in phase 4, and on down the line, there's 1.7 million displaced. Populations flung over several borders. So the humanitarian situation was becoming quite dire and starting to resemble Yemen or Syria, that type of situation. And that's why the international community started putting so much pressure on the Ethiopian government. And this rebel victory created the conditions for them to step back and stop the conflict for now.
William Lawrence, always good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera.
My pleasure.
Now, US